There are many definitions for a destructive cult. I've seen so many over the 30 plus years that I've been doing my work. And I would say that they all seem to intersect on one set of characteristics, which were written about by the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and published by Harvard University in 1981. Lifton wrote a paper called Cult Formation. And in that paper, I think he identified what I would call the nucleus for a definition of a destructive cult. Lifton laid out three simple characteristics or criterion. One is an absolute authoritarian leader who becomes the defining element and the driving force of a group, literally an object or focus of worship as the original beliefs of the group begin to drift and fade away. So you have this figure that determines what is right, what is wrong, and everyone in the group is in lockstep behind this leader who is that defining element. Second, Lifton said that you can identify a thought reform program in the group's process. That is, that the group is manipulating people to gain undue influence over them. And Lifton wrote a book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and in the 22nd chapter of that book, which was published in 1961, he outlined 8 criteria to determine if a thought reform program is ongoing within a group or environment. Lifton studied POWs in the North Korean POW camps during the Korean conflict. And he was concerned with how the North Koreans were able to control and manipulate the minds of the POWs. And his research culminated in the book that he published in 1961, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Those criteria, which include control of information, control of the environment, the cult of confession, a sacred science, meaning unquestioning submission to the philosophy of the leader, that became the criteria to understand whether or not thought reform is evident in a particular group or organization. And so that would be number 2, the existence of a thought reform program. Number 3, if we are to think of the group as a destructive cult, the group would be doing something to harm people or exploit people. And this varies in groups by degree. For example, not all groups are going to stockpile weapons, have a compound, or sexually abuse members, or deny medical care, all of which does occur in some groups. But each group has its own degree of destructiveness in my experience. So one group may exploit people simply on the basis of finances. Another leader of a group may exploit people sexually, may abuse children. So there are gradations of destructiveness from group to group, which vary by degree. But you look for those 3 primary characteristics. 1, an absolute authoritarian leader that is the defining element and driving force of the group. 2, the existence of a thought reform program to break people down, to break down independent and critical thinking and gender dependency and gain undue influence. And then finally, number 3, the culmination of 1 and 2, is the ability to exploit and do harm to people, which is then evidenced either by financial exploitation, physical abuse, or some other form of harm. You take those 3 characteristics, and I don't care whether the group says we're religious, we're science, we're political, we're therapy, those 3 characteristics become the unifying nucleus to define a destructive cult, regardless of what the group says it believes. Finally, it's not what the group says it believes, it's how the group behaves that determines whether or not it is a destructive cult. Groups that have been called destructive cults can be religious. They can also be political. They can be a therapy, an exercise, a martial arts group. I've encountered groups that were based on running. Again, the three characteristics are what you look for. So the group may be religious, it may be a commercial enterprise with multi-level marketing, it may be a weekend large group awareness training, seminar, self-help guru thing. Whatever it is, you look beyond the facade and you look for these three primary characteristics that define a destructive cult, because groups can come in many incarnations with many facades. The International Cultic Studies Association, which was created, 1979, I think, has said that they have received complaints about more than 5,000 groups in the United States alone. Now, since the advent of the internet and the web, I learn about a new group almost every day. So there are groups that may include as few as 20 or 30 people to groups that include thousands of people. What we have learned is that there are groups called cults all around the world. Whether they're in China, the United States, Canada, Europe, this is a global phenomenon. In fact, today, I think we arguably are at war with a destructive cult. And I'm referring to the Islamic State, ISIS. This is a group that recruits on the web, that recruits through social media, and then siphons its new recruits into training camps that are not unlike cult compounds in Syria and Iraq. They use deceit. They trick people into romantic fantasies about marrying jihadists or whatever the bait is that they eventually switch to abuse, degradation, and violence. They have taken relatively normal people, educated people from the United States, from Canada, from Europe, and turned them into homicidal killers, willing to blow themselves up and murder people. I think that ISIS fits the criteria for a destructive cult. Number one, al-Baghdadi, their leader, who has declared himself a caliph, and his territory, a caliphate, fits the mode of an absolute totalitarian leader that is the defining element of ISIS. Number two, I think from the accounts of families, from the accounts of former members of ISIS coming out of ISIS, escaping Syria and Iraq, there is evidence that they were manipulated, that they went through a process of coercive persuasion, and that ISIS, in fact, uses a thought reform program to create killers. And number three, I don't think anyone can argue that ISIS is not destructive. The beheadings, the bombings, the destruction of historical archaeological artifacts in Iraq and now in Syria. I mean, this is the most horrific, destructive cult that we have ever faced, perhaps in modern history. And I think that when we disabuse ourselves from the notion that ISIS is somehow an expression of Islam or an expression of radical Islam, and we begin to see it more for what it really is, a unique, destructive cult that is an idiosyncratic creation of its founder, al-Baghdadi, in much the same way that al-Qaeda was a creation of Osama bin Laden. I think that al-Baghdadi and bin Laden have as much in common with most Muslims that live in the United States, Europe, and Canada as the notorious cult leader Jim Jones, who was responsible for 900 people being murdered in Jonestown in Guyana in 1978, had in common with Christianity. I mean, Jones said, I am a Christian pastor. Al-Baghdadi and Osama bin Laden say they are, or were, the true Muslims. I would say that what they all share in common is they are destructive cult leaders. And if we are going to say that al-Baghdadi is an expression of the Islamic faith, we might as well say Jim Jones is somehow an expression of Christianity, which I don't think he was. And I don't think that this current aberration of Islam that has done this terrorism that we're now dealing with is concurrent with their beliefs either. I think many people will say, well, are we seeing more cults today than we saw, say, in the 70s or in the 80s? And I would start out by saying that many of the groups that we knew in the 70s and the 80s, for example, the Unification Church called the Moonies, which many people called a cult, or Scientology, which has been called a cult, or other groups like the Hare Krishnas, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, they're still with us. In fact, they're quite large. What we see is the proliferation of new groups and the entrenchment of old groups. So this is an ongoing situation. The cult business can be seen as a business. That is, it makes money for the people that run these groups called cults. And as long as there's money to be made, there will be destructive cult leaders to manipulate and exploit people to make more and more money. There are some groups, though, for example, Wicca, the Wiccans, or various other groups that may be eccentric and unusual but are not destructive cults. I think it is possible for a group to have an authoritarian leader and to have a certain mindset and yet not be destructive. For example, the architect Paulo Soleri created a philosophy called arcology and began to build a city in Arizona called Arco Sante. He was a kind of philosopher king, and he had a group of followers, people that believed in his philosophy, but he did not exploit them, he did not hurt them, and they did build quite a bit of buildings and architecture in the desert of Arizona. You could say that it was a kind of cult, but if it was, and Paulo Soleri is now gone, he's deceased, I think it was a benign one. So I think it is possible for people to gather around a leader and adopt a philosophy, but do no harm, and therefore be a benign cult per se. Many groups that have been called destructive cults will say that they have changed their ways. The International Society of Krishna Consciousness, which was sued by children that were sexually abused as children in that group, went through a bankruptcy, avoided closing as a group through that bankruptcy, and said, we have changed, we're not the same. And I would argue that in order for a group to change, and Michael Langone, who is the director of the International Cultic Studies Association, pointed this out in a presentation at a conference in Canada a couple of years ago. He said that in many groups there is a kind of pathology that is ingrained in the group. In other words, the leader has influenced so many people in that group. He has influenced, or she has influenced, the thinking of so many people in the group that there is an ingrained mindset in the group. And until you root out all the old people that are infected with that mindset, the group has a kind of pathology. It can be a pathology of fear, of secrecy, and so on. So I'm very skeptical about groups that say they have changed. Historically in the United States, there are people that followed William Miller, who said the end of the world would occur in 1844. Subsequently, when it didn't happen, Miller was replaced by a leader, Ellen White, who became the leader of what is now known as the Seventh-day Adventists. This organization changed from a personality-driven group under William Miller to a mainstream religion in modern America. So it is possible for some groups to change. Another example would be Jehovah's Witnesses, which was created by Charles Taze Russell. He and his successor, a man by the name of Rutherford, frequently predicted the end of the world, which did not occur. The Witnesses also evolved, but not quite as much as Seventh-day Adventists. And today, they still have much of that baggage from Russell. They were once known as the Russellites. but power has devolved to about 7 people who run Jehovah's Witnesses. But year in and year out, people die because they are members of Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't get a blood transfusion. That is a belief of Jehovah's Witnesses that continues to cause needless deaths every year, and most notably children who are denied a blood transfusion by their own parents. The courts have intervened in order to sustain the child's life to get a blood transfusion. So I think that groups can change and evolve. Some groups can completely move into the mainstream, while others not so much or not at all. Comes the defining element and the driving force of a group, literally an object or focus of worship as the original beliefs of the group begin to drift and fade away. So you have this figure that determines what is right, what is wrong, and everyone in the group is in lockstep behind this leader who is that defining element. Second, Lifton said that you can identify a thought reform program in the group's process. That is, that the group is manipulating people to gain undue influence over them. And Lifton wrote a book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and in the 22nd chapter of that book, which was published in 1961, he outlined 8 criteria to determine if a thought reform program is ongoing within a group or environment. Lifton studied POWs in the North Korean POW camps during the Korean conflict. And he was concerned with how the North Koreans were able to control and manipulate the minds of the POWs. And his research culminated in the book that he published in 19. There are many definitions for a destructive cult. I mean, I've seen so many over the 30-plus years that I've been doing my work. And I would say that they all seem to intersect on one set of characteristics, which were written about by the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and published by Harvard University in 1981. Lifton wrote a paper called Cult Formation. And in that paper, I think he identified what I would call the nucleus for a definition of a destructive cult. Lifton laid out 3 simple characteristics or criterion. One is an absolute authoritarian leader who becomes